Thank you for your word today as we begin this new year. Help us, Lord, to take personal inventory of our lives. Lord, you're going to give us X number of days and hours and minutes. You're going to give us oxygen to breathe. Lord, we have a decision every day whether we will live for ourselves or whether we will live for you. And Lord, I pray that we will live for you. Lord, we pray your Spirit would speak in this hour, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. I'm a youth of the 1980s. I look out there, I see Mark. Mark, you with me on that. You were in the 1980s. A lot of y'all, I see you nodding in your head. You were teenagers probably in the 1980s. And it was my generation, and if you were around my age, it was your generation. And there were a lot of great things about the 1980s. There were a lot of great inventions and a lot of great characteristics of the 1980s. As I said, I was a teenager then. Musically, boom boxes were very popular. Now, young kids, you may have seen it, and it probably doesn't make sense, but people in my day, when we were teenagers, used to walk around with boom boxes, music boxes, that about the fourth or a third of the size of this. And that's why we had such strong arms. And I'll say I did hold mine once or twice, and I did that, just sort of posing. But that wasn't the only thing. The cassette player was replaced by, get this, the compact disc player. I mean, we really arrived. In 1982, compact disc came out, and I can remember the first one I heard and how crystal clear it was and how easy it was to operate. Politically, Reaganomics was the thing, trickle-down economics. And I just read that this week, that really it was the 1980s when the term global warming really became popular and it's still talked about today. We had our toys in the 1980s. Cabbage Patch Dolls, those were a 1980s thing. Transformers, I think they're movies that come out. Jackson needs to know that. Transformers had its beginning in the 1980s, and they were great, and kids today love to play. But they weren't to be surpassed because the games of the 1980s were really awesome. You had Game Boy that came out then, Rubik's Cube, Pac-Man. Who could forget that? How many times did you probably hang out somewhere playing Pac-Man? Or my favorite, Gallagher. I never could beat my best friend at that. We put our mark on fashion in the 1980s. And ladies, you had big hair. And Karen did have big hair. And I didn't know her to the end of the 80s, but I saw pictures. Big hair and shoulder pads. Those came out in the 1980s. We had our Air Jordans and our members' only jackets. I still remember when I talked about how popular they were. I guess it was about 10 years ago. I said they're out of style now, and then I saw Earl Morris after church. He said, I still have one. They were out of style. With all of the good of the decade of the 1980s, there were some bad things that happened too. I remember in 1986, I was in my work study program in Hampton, Sydney, and I went into an office and I saw the Spaceship Challenger. I actually saw it, and maybe you did too, as it began to go up in the air and then just disintegrated. But probably the worst thing of the 1980s, the thing I would say that was not so good that came out of that generation, was we, the young people of that generation, became known as the Me First generation. Now, the anti-establishment movement of the 1960s preceded this, followed by sort of the Me generation of the 70s. But then the 1980s became the Me First generation. And I don't think that we've recovered from it. If we're not careful, the Me First movement, which really predated the 1980s, can characterize us in the church. We're not careful, we begin to look at ourselves as the center of the universe. That the church, that its ministry exists for me, that I must be catered to rather than I must serve others. During the month of January, we're going to be focusing on God's kingdom and our need to invest in it. And I would ask you, as I ask myself, to take personal inventory during this time. How am I contributing to God's work? What am I doing in the ministry of the local church? The wonderful thing is that you and I can invest We can invest by serving inside the walls of the church and outside of its walls. We can give of our time. We can give of our treasure and our talents. We can invest in praying for our brothers and sisters and those who don't know Christ. We certainly can and should be supporting foreign missions. Today we're looking at 3 John, and John is writing this letter during the last decade, the early part of the last decade of the 90s AD. We studied this tiny book about 2 years ago. We're going to look at it from really a totally different perspective today because I want to revisit it and look specifically at this man named Gaius and how you and I ought to be serving God by serving others. This one chapter book is written to a person, not an entire church. It's written to a man named Gaius. We know very little about him. I wish we knew more, but we don't. His name was very popular in that day among Romans, so we can't tell you that much about him specifically other than what we read here. But what we read here is sufficient for us to get an idea of the heart of this man. Everything we read about Gaius is commendable. Yet there's another man that we read in about the latter part of the chapter, beginning in verse 9, Diotrephes, who was not commended in any way. And so the difference between these two men really had to do with how each responded to the opportunity to contribute to God's work. Gaius served God's service. He had a servant's heart. Gaius would be the type of the local church today that would be ready and willing to help a brother, to help a sister. Diotrephes, he was not that way. He was not concerned about the work of God. He was concerned only about himself. So I want to look at these two men. And then there's one other man I want to look at mentioned in verse 12, Demetrius. And we're sort of going to get a picture of what God desires from us as followers of him. The first person, again, in the priority of today's message is this man, Gaius. A person commended as one who served the kingdom of God by serving fellow Christians. Years ago, I read a statement by a man I never knew. This man's name was Dr. J. Carson, and he served in New York City years ago. And he said this, and it made such an impression on me that I wrote it in a book that I keep there at my house. It says, every saved person is either a channel through which the Spirit of God reaches the unsaved, or a barrier preventing the Spirit of God from doing His work. Now, Gaius was the former. He was a channel of blessing to other believers. Would you like that to be said of you? That person is a channel of blessing to other people. That person really serves with the servant's heart, the Lord Jesus Christ. Gaius was that type of person. But we can't be that way if we have a me-first attitude. He was able to be a blessing because his soul was in a good state. Look at verse 2. Well, first in verse 1, John was the elder, not only because he was older at that time of his life, but he also had direct connection to the Lord. He was an authority figure. He's writing to Gaius, and he says, I pray in verse 2 that you may prosper in every way and be in good health just as your soul prospers. In other words, he's saying, I hope that your physical health matches your spiritual well-being. Wouldn't that be great that our spiritual well-being is so strong that someone would say, I pray physically that you'll do as well as you're doing spiritually. Well, anyway, a central theme of this book is this word truth. And so the word truth is mentioned in 5 verses. Basically, a third of the verses of this tiny book, you see that word truth. And so as we look at it, we see Gaius' relationship to the truth. He was faithful to the truth. He walked in the truth. He was a joint worker with the truth. We see that throughout this chapter, throughout this book. And the word truth is not something subjective, but it is the objective standard of biblical teaching, God's truth, Christian faith, and its doctrines. In other words, he was faithful to the truth. What he was doing is he was living his life in light of and in focus on the truth of God. In all of this points that he was dedicated to the truth of the gospel, to the advancement of the gospel in the world. Now, in what way do we see this? Well, he was serving fellow believers. Look at verse 5. He says, dear friend, you are showing your faith by whatever you do. Now, James talks about the relationship between faith and works. And basically what John is saying here is the same thing that James says elsewhere. That this man, Gaius, he was demonstrating his faith by his works, by the things that he was doing. Now, what was he doing? Well, we see in verse 5. Whatever you do for the brothers, and this you're doing for strangers. Now, it's interesting. He says you're doing for these individuals who are brothers, yet also strangers. Now, how can they be both a brother and a stranger? Well, in that day, there were itinerant preachers that would travel, and so they may come into a particular area. And Paul's writing this letter. John is writing this letter from Ephesus, probably to one of the churches or areas that's around area of Ephesus to Gaius. And basically what he's doing is he's commending him because he was taking in these strangers. He was taking in these ministers who needed support. They did not have hotels in that day, and so they were dependent upon the generosity and the kindness of fellow Christians, and Gaius was one of those individuals. Now, it doesn't mention that Gaius went out and preached in the circuit, but what it meant was that he supported those who were doing so. And it was good that he was doing that, because in doing so, he was serving God. He tells us in verse 6 that those ministers had testified to your love before the church. In other words, they were coming back, and you know what they were saying? They were saying Gaius was a great encouragement. He was supportive of what we were doing. He kept the light on for us. He served us. He was concerned about us. He was involved in the ministry. And so in a way, he was ministering to them. But in serving these ministers, he was actually serving God. Notice what it says in the end of verse 6. You will do well to send them on their journey. Again, these ministers would come. They would be in one area. He would minister to them when they were in his area, Gaius, and then he would send them off with a bag lunch. He would send them off and encourage them until they could get to the next place. And so he says, you'll do well to send them on a journey in a manner worthy of God. In other words, he's saying, treat them the way you would treat it as if God were with you. And he says, why is that? Because they're going out for the sake of the name. That's what it says in verse 7. They were speaking the truth of God. So when we serve God in the church, when we serve others in whatever area, it's as if we're serving God himself. Remember in Matthew chapter 25, beginning around verse 40, it says, as you've done unto the least of these, so you've done unto me. But not only was it good that he was doing so and that he was serving God, but also these ministers were dependent upon him. They were dependent upon the support of fellow believers. Notice what it says at the end of verse 7, that they were sent out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from pagans. In other words, they were dependent upon Christians for their support. And Gaius was one who was supporting them, providing what they needed so that they could continue to minister. In fact, it's such a good thing that John tells him here that Gaius was jointly working with him. It says in verse 8, therefore we ought to support such men, and he's basically commending him for what he's doing so that we can be co-workers with the truth. In other words, Gaius may have never left the area where he was living, but he was working with the truth by supporting these missionaries, these ministers who were traveling through. Now, how does this apply to us today? We have hotels today. We have a lot of things, but there's a twofold application that I see. One is this. Hospitality is a vital and effective ministry in the church. I think our ladies have been studying about the subject of hospitality maybe in the last few months. It is a beautiful ministry. It is a ministry in which we invest in others through fellowship. We build community. We encourage. We support others. Hosting others. Giving of our time. I've benefited from that. Maybe you don't know Karen's story, but Karen felt called to go into ministry about 8 years before we ever met. I'm thankful she waited for me to find me and marry. But she felt a clear call. You know how she felt that call? Was she had a pastor's wife that opened up their home. And Karen would iron, and would hang out, and fellowship, and eat with them. And through that ministry of hospitality, God was placing a call on her life. People, we only have so much time in 2019. If we're not careful, we'll invest our whole life focusing on ourselves. My financial situation, my health situation. You know, if you're struggling with a health situation, one of the best ways is to minister to other people. I was so encouraged. I think Patsy, she's getting ready to have a procedure done, and you know, a little apprehensive about it, but she said that Sean set a great example for her because she's trying to stay so positive through it. And so whatever we're going through, if we're not careful, we can become inward looking. Gaius wasn't that way. Here, I want to help you. I want to serve you. I want to be there. And so hospitality is a great ministry. But another thing, the support of foreign missions is imperative. I so much appreciate our WU support of lighting up the Christmas offering. We had a great meeting the other night. We are exceeding our goal. We've set our goal higher and higher, and we're going to continue to receive gifts through the month of January. You may never be able to go on a foreign mission field, but you can serve brothers who are strangers, as it says in verse 5. You say, how can I serve a brother who's a stranger? By giving to international missions, by supporting the work. 100% of the money goes into the foreign mission field. And so in giving, we're co-workers with the truth in verse 8, just as he was with those itinerant preachers. Gaius may have never gone out of his home or his area, but where he was ministering by supporting the work of those who were going around the area preaching the gospel. And so we see that Gaius is rightly commended. But I want you to look at this second individual, Diotrephes. He was one dedicated to stopping the support of Christians. Now, that sounds bad, doesn't it? But it's exactly what it was. Here was Diotrephes in the church, trying to quench the work of the ministry that the church was doing. It sounds strange. A Christian not supporting Christian work. But that's how he's depicted. Whether he's a believer or not, I can't say. But I do know that he was in the church because it said that something was sent to the church, but Diotrephes would not receive us. And so he was in the church, but he was hindering the work of the Christians. Now, how was he doing it? Through his speech. Notice what he says in verse 10. John says, this is why if I come, I will remind him of the works he is doing. Now remember, Gaius, what type of works was he doing? Good works, supporting financially, supporting with hospitality, encouraging and exhorting, looking beyond himself to kingdom work. What about Diotrephes? I'll remind him of the works that he's doing, slandering us with malicious words. He was gossiping. He was speaking negatively. Let me issue a warning here. If I had a bright, flashing red light, it would be going on. Do not criticize the work of the ministry of the church. Don't criticize it. Don't criticize it. Don't say, why do we need to be supporting foreign missions? We've got enough stuff around here. Why are we doing this? Don't do that. In our speech, we can actually truncate the work of God. We can be a hindrance to the work of God, and Diotrephes was that way. But not only that, he didn't stop with his speech. But it says in verse 10, and he's not satisfied with that. He not only refuses to welcome the brothers himself, no room for them, but he even stops those who wants to do so and expels them from the church. Intimidation. He was intimidating Diotrephes in the church. So a minister was coming through and needed help. And this wasn't just anybody, this was a minister that was coming through. He said, I'm not going to help you. And then what he did is he said, and in my authority, anybody that helps him, you're out of the church. And so we see here that John was frustrated with this individual who was so territorial. You know what he sounds like? Who he sounds like? Herod. We just studied Herod in Sunday school. Herod was threatened by the advancement of the work of God through Jesus. Diotrephes was threatened. Well, why was he doing it? And here's where we need to be careful. Because in verse 9 it says, I wrote some of the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have first place. Diotrephes was in the church, but it was all about him. What he wanted, what he approved of, what his needs were. You see, for him, the church in which he was involved existed not to advance the gospel. It existed not to bring glory to God. It existed to meet his requirements. And if anyone went against that, he tried to cast him out. He would have fit in the 80s model here, me first. And I'm ashamed to say in many circles today, the point is this, which I actually think. The church and its ministry this year do not primarily exist for you. It does not exist to meet your wants. We're called to serve in the church, not have the church serve us. And during this month, we're going to be focusing on hands-on ministry in 2019. It may be with children. It may be in music, missions, teaching, greeting, other ministries. But where we're going to be this month is, Lord, in 2019, how am I going to use this year? How am I going to invest? And once we get a clear direction from the Lord, then we go in his power and we begin to serve others in the spirit of Gaius, forsaking this attitude of Diotrephes, who focused only on himself. You see, he had it all wrong, Diotrephes did. But I want you to see this third individual that's mentioned. The back end of this letter in verse 12, we see Demetrius mentioned. This is a person measured as good by man and by God. Very little is said about Demetrius also. So what we have of these three individuals is what we see here. You know, in our lives, that's true so many times. The perception that people have may just be a small window. They may see us in Walmart. They may see us in a workplace. And that's all they have of what they see. And so we need to always be alert of the testimony we're giving. And the good thing is that Demetrius had a good testimony. It says of Demetrius, he had a good testimony from everyone and from the truth itself. He was measured good by men and by God. I don't know about you, but I would love to be measured good by men. But it's more important to be measured good by the truth. You see, men fluctuate. Men don't know everything. I may have a good word to say about you, but I don't see you 24 hours a day. I may have good thoughts about you, but I am limited in my understanding. But the truth is not limited. And so he said, not only does he have a good testimony by men, and we as believers ought to want to have a good testimony before everyone, but also he had a good testimony by the truth. We don't always judge rightly, but the truth does. And I might add this also. Demetrius was serving the Lord. Most people think that he may have been the messenger carrying a letter between Gaius and John. And so we see here's a man who's serving God. That's what we're called to do. Serve the Lord under the power of God, under the direction of God, in obedience to God in 2019. What am I going to do with my life in 2019? I was reading the story of Dwight L. Moody. And I love this, and it would be typical D.L. Moody. He was once preaching in London, and after preaching, he was criticized by a self-proclaimed critic. Can you imagine that, somebody criticizing Dwight Moody? The man said to Moody, he said, "You made several grammatical mistakes in your message today." He said that after Moody had preached to a number of people. Moody, in a humble way, acknowledged with regret that his grammar was faulty. And then I like what he said to the court. He said, "I'm using all of the grammar I know for God." What are you doing with the grammar? That's point. Are you using what you have for God? You say, "I don't have that much." Are you using what you have? You say, "I love Gaines. He has a good testimony as one who was serving the kingdom by serving others." Are you teaching in Sunday school? Are you teaching in BBS this year? Are you working in a local mission? Are you working in the WMU? Are you serving by ministering in the choir? Are you carrying out a greeting ministry? I could go on and on. Are you serving on the social committee, which, by the way, I forgot to announce you have a meeting right after church today. In the Lord, in the Spirit of the Lord. What are you doing with what God has given you? Diotrephes, he was living for himself. He was a friend. He was dried up and trying to dry the one up. Yes. And this year, we have a choice. What are we going to do? Let me encourage you. Be like a Gaines. Look for the best of Let's pray. Father, we thank you today for the opportunity to be in this place, in this first week of the year. And I pray, Lord, at the close of this year, should you tarry, should we have this time this year on this earth, that we would look back and say, with sincere hearts, we serve your kingdom by serving others in Jesus' name and serving them in a manner worthy of God. Lord, I realize that how that applies today can be in varied areas, in varied ministries. And I thank you that even as we look at the variety of the seasons, and even as we look at the variety of day by day, you're a God of variety. And Lord, you have placed each member in your church unified, but not uniform. We have different gifts, different callings. Lord, may we be faithful to serve you this year. I pray your Spirit would stir our hearts, that, Lord, we wouldn't waste this year living for ourselves, but that we would invest in you.